This is the story of a young man, Samir, who went to stay with his beautiful and lonely aunt while his uncle was away. The story explores their interactions, misunderstandings, and emotional struggles, highlighting the importance of self-control and respect in relationships. Through this tale, a lesson emerges about staying vigilant against temptation and maintaining the sanctity of family bonds. My aunt was very beautiful and young. She used to live alone at home and used to call me to her house. She used to get rid of her loneliness. I used to happily go to my aunt and spend some beautiful moments with her. One day, my aunt called me to her house. I happily went to my aunt's house. As soon as I reached my aunt's house, my aunt was coming out of the washroom. As soon as I saw my aunt, I lost my senses. My aunt showed me her face. My aunt was very beautiful. She didn't look like a married woman. At that time, I came to stay at my uncle's house because my uncle and aunt were going abroad. When my uncle came to congratulate my uncle, he told my uncle to leave Samir at our house. My uncle stopped him a lot that now Samir has grown up and can take care of himself. But he didn't listen and he convinced my uncle. And my wish came true. I had the key to our old house, which was lying empty. I used to use it a lot for my house. Aunt Monica got married 10 years before my uncle.
I was 10 years old at that time.
But at that time, I used to feel very good when I saw my aunt, because she was not only beautiful but also had a soft tone and a full body. My uncle and aunt were like a pair of missiles, but they were still far away from their children. They were patient considering their fate. My aunt and uncle loved each other a lot, and I had an idea that my uncle must have spent many nights with them. After marriage, my aunt's body had become very beautiful. She was already beautiful, but now every part of the body felt like it was bowing towards itself. At that time, when my aunt was cleaning the house and I was watching TV, then my aunt asked me, "Samir, don't you have to go to college today?" So, in my heart, I said, "No, aunt, the semester is over, isn't it? So there are 1.5 months of holidays." My aunt shook her head and started knocking on the table. But seeing all that, I couldn't understand what to do and what not to do. 2 days had passed since I had come to my aunt's house. At the dinner table at night, my uncle told my aunt that he had to go to Lahore for 20 days. If he had to go out for more days, he would have taken my aunt along. But this time I was at my aunt's house, so he thought it was better to go alone. I had practiced my aunt's routine and her habits well. I saw that she uses tea a lot, and she puts a lot of milk in the tea, and I was used to drinking boxed milk. The next day, we friends were joking with each other, and whatever I was talking about was very dirty. My aunt was very surprised to hear me. Then she gave me her voice and tried to make me feel her presence. I couldn't hear anything because of the music. She kept listening to my dirty talks for a long time, and then she got up and went to her room. In the evening, I started going out with my friends. I went to her room to tell 2 aunts. At that time, nothing special was in my mind. Then I came back and lay on the bed. After a while, I said, "I want to drink tea." Aunt smiled and said, "Why not, my child? I'll freshen up in 2 minutes and then I'll make it." She got up and went to the bathroom. I sat in the gallery and started looking at the pots and flowers in front. I liked one flower. I looked at it closely and then broke it. Aunt was calling me. I answered. When I was outside, she came out with a tray in her hand, which had 2 cups of tea. She gave me 1 cup and put the other one on the table. I put the flower in my hand and gave it to Aunt. She smiled and took the flower from my hand and said, "Thank you, my child." All my desires were fulfilled. I looked at Aunt and said, "Don't you get bored staying at home all day?" "I'm bored. Let's go out somewhere." Aunt said, "No, Samir. I go everywhere with your uncle, but I don't go anywhere without him." I quietly started drinking tea. After dinner, I started watching a movie. Aunt also sat next to me and started watching the movie. When Aunt saw that this was the same nonsense that I was doing while playing the game in the afternoon, she said, "Okay, so you have learned all the abuses and nonsense from here." She said, "Son, this is a very bad thing. You use very bad language." I was embarrassed. Aunt said again, "I will talk to your father to keep an eye on you. You are getting out of hand." I looked up and said to Aunt, "I made a mistake, Aunt. Forgive me, but what should I do? All boys watch such movies.
I also have to answer them. So such things come out of the mouth.
Hearing what I said, Aunt started laughing and said, Don't be afraid. I won't say anything to anyone. I know what kind of things you boys say. Okay, fine. Make another movie. What is this? Then I started breathing. And I asked Aunt, which movie should I put in, Aunt? She said, make an Indian movie. I made an Indian movie. Aunt was watching the movie. And I was secretly watching Aunt. Aunt lifted one leg and put it on the other leg and sat comfortably on the sofa. Then I also lifted one leg and put it on the other leg. I felt that Aunt has noticed this action of mine. And there was a slight smile on her face. I was also sitting on the other corner like Aunt. Then Aunt smiled and corrected her position. And I also saw her and thought it was better to sit properly. Aunt started laughing and said, Samir, you are copying me. I looked at her and shook my head. She said in a little anger, Why are you bothering me? I smiled and said, I like to bother you.
She said, Why?
I said immediately, It's been so many days. No one has scolded you, nor shoes from anyone. On top of that, you are very boring. Hearing what I said, she got angry. She said, Samir, am I really boring? I said, I don't know what will happen to me by being alone. Aunt smiled and said, If you want to get beaten, I will give you. She thought I was an innocent, mischievous child. And this was for my benefit. Maybe by talking nonsense like this, Aunt got very close to me. When Uncle's phone rang at 11 o'clock at night, she got up and went to her room. I also watched the movie for a while and switched off the TV and started going towards my room. That's when I heard Aunt's voice from Aunt's room. I am missing you a lot. I don't know how these days will pass.
I don't know what was said from the other side.
But what Aunt said, it was no less than a surprise for me. I got up early in the morning and got fresh and went to the kitchen. There was no one in the kitchen. I went to Aunt's room and saw that the door was closed. That means Aunt was sleeping. I went to the kitchen and made tea for myself, and then heated some slices, sat on the table, and started having breakfast. I was having breakfast. That's when the door of Aunt's room opened. She came out, looking at me, a little embarrassed, said, I couldn't sleep at night.
I had slept for a long time.
That's why I couldn't get up early in the morning. I smiled and said, It's okay. You have to have breakfast. Come on, I'll make your breakfast today. She said, You? More breakfast? What's the matter there? I said, Come fresh. I'll make breakfast. Then we'll talk. Aunt shook her head and went back to her room smiling. Then I said, Aunt, what do you like for breakfast? Aunt said, Whatever you make, I will eat happily. I bowed my head again and said, As you wish, and turned around and went to the kitchen. After making breakfast, I came to the kitchen and called out to Aunt. Aunt came to the hall and sat on the chair. I said, Aunt, your breakfast is ready, and put the tray in front of her. Aunt was smiling at me. Aunt turned her head on my head and ruined my hair. I held her hand, which was on my head, and said, Aunt, you ruined the style of my hair. Aunt gently slapped me on my cheek and said, Nothing bad happened. Sit comfortably and have breakfast. Aunt had breakfast and said, Samir, thank you very much. Let's be good friends. Today, after many days, I am smiling like this and had such a good breakfast. I made a face and said, What happened, Aunt? Am I not your friend? Aunt pinched my cheek and said, We may be friends, but we are strangers. Today, let's be good friends. I pinched my cheek and said, Oh, ants have a very bad habit. They turn their cheeks red. Aunt started smiling and extended both her hands towards my ears. Then I started running. Aunt started running behind me with a smile and said, Wait, I'll hit you. I stopped and put my hand on my waist and said, Okay. Then she sat on the chair in front of her. I went to her and said, What happened? Aunt stood up and pinched both my ears and started laughing. I made a crying face and said, I don't expect any love from you. You are very cruel. Aunt looked at me with a smile and started loving me where she had pinched me. I said, Sorry, friend. Aunt separated from me. I said, Okay, I'll go and change. Then I have to get that stuff from the market. They bring it. I said, okay, I'll also change. Maybe a girl will fall for me and I'll also have fun. Aunt put a slap on my waist with a smile and said, Samir, have some shame. I said, with what? Aunt said, with her stormy actions. I said, friend, there should be a little fun in life. Otherwise, you will not leave me for any work all my life. Aunt didn't understand me at first. But when she understood, she took off her shoes from her feet and started saying, have some shame, Samir. I laughed and went to my room. After a while, I came out of the camera and sat on the sofa and started watching TV. In a while, Anne also came out. When she came out, my breath was up and down. On a white shirt, looking at Aunt in the jeans below, I said, what is Madam's intention? Aunt first looked at herself, then looked at me and said, why? What happened? Keeping my hand on my heart, I said, Madam, there must be thousands of crazy people in your city. But who will open a shop so early in the morning? Aunt realized her mistake and said, you are right. I said, Madam, when you come out, people must be looking at you. Aunt smiled and said, Samir, have some shame. I am your aunt. I also bowed my head and said, okay, Aunt. Then she started laughing. She sat next to me and said, you will not stop flirting. I looked at her and said, who wants to flirt with you? Aunt smiled and said, forgive me, friend. After a while of silence, Aunt came close to me and said, you really don't have a girlfriend. I looked at her and said, I haven't found anyone like you. Otherwise, I would have made her my life partner, even if I had to convince my father. Aunt smiled and said, I like you. Then I bowed my head like a lover and said, too much, Aunt. Aunt said, you will not stop. Aunt said, Samir, bring milk. It's over. I bowed my head and went to the market. I came back, put the milk pot in the freezer, and went to tell Aunt in her room. But the scene in front of me was enough to drive me crazy. Aunt had probably taken a bath, and this time was wreaking havoc on me. And I was in such a state that there was no life in my legs. I was about to turn around when Aunt called out to me and asked, did you bring milk? I couldn't even make a sound. I shook my head and Aunt slowly walked towards me and put her hand under my face and said, what happened, Samir? I lifted my face up and looked into her eyes and said, nothing, Aunt. Aunt looked into my eyes and said, Samir, tell me the truth. Is it good for me to come in front of you like this? What? I shook my head and bowed my head again and said, if you think I'm being attracted to you, then you're wrong, Aunt. Aunt, your body is a means of expressing your love. But this is not all right. Aunt took a deep breath and looked at me like I was crazy. I raised my head again and said, but I don't want you to be away from me for a while and then for the rest of my life. It was a very delicate decision for Aunt. Then she sat on one side of the bed and said, come to me and sit here. I walked comfortably to her. She held my hand and placed it on her other hand and said, you should be thankful for what you get, Samir. What was going on in Aunt's mind, and what was going on in her mind, and at that time, it was about to leave the battlefield and run away. I came back to the room in peace. Then I felt that Aunt was crying inside. Her wheezing was coming out. I went to the door and said, are you okay? There was no answer from inside. The wheezing stopped. I asked again, what's wrong, Aunt? Why are you crying? I heard a voice from inside, Samir. I want to be alone for a while. Please go to your room. I said, okay. Are you okay? Auntie said, I am fine. I didn't understand what to do next. I came back quickly. Then after a while, Auntie also came out fresh and started apologizing to me. After that day, I started taking a lot of care of Auntie because she had become very lonely and started loving me. I called my uncle and called him back. Auntie was a young and beautiful woman. That's why she was very eager to get rid of her loneliness. But thank God, we didn't have any such relationship. I spent a few more days at Auntie's house. And then my parents came back home, and I went back to my house. I want to tell everyone that never leave your sister or wife alone at home because the devil can mislead you anytime. And it is the devil's misguidance that makes a person commit this mistake. So before doing this, think 1,000 times because your homes can break. Men are advised not to leave their sister or wife in the hands of anyone.